Welcome, panelists, and I'm really excited to be here, and I think we're all completely optimistic and hopeful after listening to Dr. Mate and just understanding that it all comes down to the people you love in your community, and that's why we're here. So, and I really liked your emphasis on equity too, so thank you very much. That is still an important word in Massachusetts, so I'm really proud to live in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So my first question of the day will really be about sort of where we are in Massachusetts, and we have a lot of funding challenges. We could go into HR 1 or OBB 3 or whatever you're calling it these days. And we have workforce shortages, and at the end of the day, we need to figure out a way out of the situation. We've been down this road many, many times. I think Alice Rivlin and Josh Wiener wrote a book, Paying for the Elderly and the Disabled, in 1988. We read that book and we thought, oh, that makes a lot of sense to have a social insurance program. And so here we are, and Massachusetts has taken quite a few shots at this in terms of securing the future. And recently, an LTSS Feasibility Study. I hope we get there. I think this panel can help us journey there today. So with that in mind, I really want to think about, are we at a critical inflection point to reimagine how we finance and deliver LTSS? Do we have a political imperative to do so? And I'm going to turn this over to Catherine to give us the first response to that question.
Okay,
Great.
Is this working? Can you all hear me? Okay, great.
Yeah.
Hi, it's so great to be here. I want to just start by saying a quick thank you to Marta, to Colleen, to the full team at SCES for just putting on such a phenomenal event. I feel really fortunate to just get the opportunity to be here and be part of this conversation, to hear such a phenomenal keynote address. Really, providing hope in a time that I think that's what we need to be focused on right now, is how we can affect positive change. So thank you. And Ellen, to answer your question, yes, we are at a critical inflection point right now when it comes to the need to find a different way to finance long-term services and supports in the Commonwealth. And I think in many ways we're at sort of a perfect storm. There are a lot of factors that are coming into play all at once that are putting a huge amount, I think, of urgency around this issue. But because I am here representing the Massachusetts Medicaid Policy Institute, I'm going to focus my remarks on the pressures that are coming from Medicaid, knowing that my fellow panelists will address many of the others. And so just a little background for that, as I think won't be a surprise to everyone here in the room, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, Medicaid really is the primary payer currently for long-term services and supports for most of us here in Massachusetts. And that's because Medicare and private health insurance, they don't cover comprehensive long-term services and supports. And only about 8% of Massachusetts residents have private long-term care coverage. And what that means is that for most of us, we're really relying on the Medicaid program to pay for, to cover the long-term services and supports that we're going to need as we age. But this setup of sort of primarily relying on Medicaid to finance long-term services and supports, it has never been an ideal setup. And that's for a few reasons. It's not ideal from the individual's perspective because essentially what it requires is that it requires many older adults to spend down their income and their life savings until paying for long-term services and supports until they qualify for the Medicaid program. So here in Massachusetts, for most people age 65 and older, for Medicaid to cover your long-term services and supports, you need to have an income below $15,000 a year for an individual, and you need your assets to be below $2,000 a year for an individual. So this just really puts families in an excruciating position of having to spend down their life savings. Middle-income families spend down their life savings paying for long-term services and supports so that they can qualify for Medicaid coverage moving forward. So not ideal from an individual perspective. It's also not ideal from a systems perspective. That's because long-term services and supports, by their nature, they're extremely expensive. I think we heard Marta, I think it was Marta earlier today talking about, $15,000 a month for nursing home care. And Mass Health already is a really big budget item, and for good reason. Mass Health covers critical services and supports for over 1/4 of Massachusetts residents. So it's going to be a big budget item. That's something we value in this state. That makes sense. But if you look at Mass Health, if you take away the federal support that helps to finance Medicaid, and you look just at the state funding that finances the Medicaid program, it comprises 20% of our state budget. That is a big budget item. And long-term services and supports is a huge part of that. So long-term services and supports here in Massachusetts, they constitute about 37% of all Medicaid expenditures. So nearly 40% of this big budget item is long-term services and supports. And I know my fellow panelists are going to talk about the aging demographics in this country and in this state, but if we project that out and think about what that's going to mean for the Medicaid program and for our state budget moving forward, it's not necessarily a sustainable practice for us to continue to rely primarily on the Medicaid program to finance long-term services and supports. But here's the thing, Ellen, you asked what makes now a critical inflection point, and to be honest, I could have said everything I've said to this point on this panel. I could have said this last year, the year before, the year before. I mean, this has been true for quite some time. So what makes this year a critical inflection point? HR 1. Or the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OB3. There's a lot of names for it, but the big bill that Congress passed into law this past July, I'm going to call it OB3 moving forward, that it makes deep and unprecedented cuts in Medicaid funding nationwide, and they're going to have big impacts here in Massachusetts. And it makes this question of how do we finance long-term services and supports moving forward, it makes it all the more urgent. Okay, so I know state officials here in Massachusetts have looked into OB3, and what they've found is that when the law is in full effect, we can expect to see 3.5 billion fewer federal dollars coming into our state to help finance our Medicaid program and other subsidized coverage in our state. 3.5 billion fewer federal dollars per year. This is a huge hit to our Medicaid program here in Massachusetts, as it will be in states across the country. And it's going to put our policymakers, our administrators in a really difficult position of having to make extraordinarily challenging choices about where to make cuts in the Medicaid program. And I don't have a crystal ball, and I am not one of those people, thank goodness, that has to make these choices. But it's hard for me to believe that they're not going to be looking at long-term services and supports. We just talked about it's almost 40% of the Medicaid expenditures here in Massachusetts. And we know that many of the long-term services and supports that we use here in Massachusetts through our Medicaid program, many of the home and community-based services, those are optional. So the federal government, it requires states to cover nursing home care through their Medicaid programs, but most of the home and community-based services, those are optional. So it's going to put a lot of pressure on policymakers to be looking for places to cut, and I think a big potential target is going to be long-term services and supports. So I think, not wanting to leave us on a really bad note and trying to find hope where we can, I will say that the good news, to the extent that there is good news, is that most of the biggest financing cuts in the law, they actually don't take effect until 2028, around there, and then they kind of ratchet up from there. So we do have some time to plan for this. And I think, so if you take anything away from anything that I say moving forward on this panel, it's really that it has never been ideal for us to rely primarily on Medicaid as the payer for long-term services and supports. But because of OB3 and the historic nature of the cuts it makes to the Medicaid program, it really puts an imperative on us as a Commonwealth to rethink about how we finance long-term services and supports moving forward.
Great answer. There is an impetus to do this with HR 1 cuts, with HCBS benefits being optional, which HCBS is about 75%, 80% of the LTSS budget. So we need to be hopeful and move forward. So with that in mind, Mark, can you tell us and share your perspective, if you agree? Are we at a major inflection point right now where we need to act?
Thanks. Can everybody hear me? Great. So I'm so happy that Dr. Mattei brought us way, way up, because as we have a high starting point to move down with all the news. I was looking at my notes right now, and I'm thinking I'm going to talk very briefly about 4 trends. All of them sound negative, but they really present opportunities, and I truly believe that. So I think somebody already mentioned the fact that there's a confluence of factors that leave me hopeful. So the first, as most of us know, the primary providers of LTSS in our system are family caregivers. And it turns out that that system, the family caregiving system, is under tremendous stress right now. We were talking in one of our preparatory calls, and somebody mentioned the fact that, there's this sandwich generation. And I made the observation that I don't call them the sandwich generation anymore. I call them the panini generation. They are squeezed financially, as well as in terms of their time allocation between children and older adults. And there are a lot of reasons for this. I'll just name a few of them. Smaller family size, the fact that many family members now or adult children no longer live near their aging parents, later childbirth, supply shortages in the paid workforce put additional stress on the family caregiving system, and also restrictions on immigration. 1/3 of our workforce traditionally has been comprised of immigrants. So how could I just give you all these facts and say that it makes me hopeful? One of my themes is that for policy change to happen, it has to happen from the ground up. I think we're going to see, and we're starting to see it already, the burden associated with family caregiving is getting such that there's a natural constituency to push for policy change. So that's one trend. The second, which Catherine mentioned, is we've got $3.5 billion coming out of the Medicaid system. And I think policymakers for a long time in the state have understood that LTSS financing is a real challenge. And I was reminded 15 years ago, Governor Deval Patrick established a task force. And I was on that task force, and I remember the projections at the time were showing that unless there was some way to check this growth, other policy priorities of importance to the state would be crowded out. And here we are 15 years later, and actually we have members of the legislature who were mentioned today, and I hope are in this room, Senator Jalen, Representative Stanley, who together have pushed forward an actuarial study. They put an actuarial study in the budget, the most recent budget, and that study has been completed. Someone will be talking about that later, but the point is that it was an actuarial study to look at alternative financing options and to provide an intellectual infrastructure or information base from which we could have discussions, look at policy trade-offs, and so on. So that is the second thing that's happened. It sounds so trivial, an actuarial study. but it's not, and I'll return to that theme at a later question. In essence, there's a growing number of policyholders in our state who are coming to realize that the cost of doing nothing is exceeding the cost of doing something. Even if we're not sure what, people understand, like, this path is not sustainable. That's another positive. Third, there's a great deal of advocacy effort on issues of LTSS financing and service delivery that have been devoted to people that are accessing and getting their services paid for by the social safety net, by Mass Health, by Medicaid across the country. And yet, a growing number of people derive from a group that I refer to as the overlooked middle. These are people who can cover their basic living needs, would not likely qualify for coverage under Medicaid, or here Mass Health, and they'd be able to only afford a little bit of LTSS if they needed it. They have few alternatives available to them, and they're at risk for significant financial losses, Catherine has pointed out, trying to become or having to become eligible for Medicaid. They are starting to bring their voices forward on this issue. I'm working right now with the state of California on this issue, and there's more and more pressure growing from the middle class, the overlooked middle, because they don't even have a Medicaid. Finally, this is an issue that, at least in my view, does not lend itself to this kind of standard partisan divide of Republican versus Democratic issue. Everyone knows someone who has had LTSS needs, who has been a caregiver, who has struggled under the financial burden of caring for an elderly relative or friend. And this makes it possible to come together. We actually have an example in Washington, D.C. that's been under the radar screen. For a good number of years, I've been working with Congressman Tom Suozzi, who introduced something called the WISH Act, which is basically a catastrophic insurance program for LTSS. And he now has obtained some Republican co-sponsors. So I think that we see that there is a sense that the current system ain't working, and that social insurance approaches we'll have more to say about that in a minute, but social insurance approaches, communal approaches, may help relieve pressure on the Medicaid system and offer alternatives to a much broader swath of the population.
Thank you. That's a great note to really sort of move on to the next speaker, that social insurance programs and the whole picture that you gave us, given your history. And I remember securing the future in Massachusetts in 2010, and it didn't go anywhere because the time might not have been right. And so there's a lot of hope here about the future. So I want to turn to you, Bree, because you have so much experience as in this arena, but also because I wanted to ask you to share more about the demographics, more about the feasibility study, and what the prospects are, in your opinion. Thanks.
Is this on? Yes, it is. Thank you so much, and thank you to Marta and this SCES team, and to all of you guys. Just listening to you talk is so exciting because it's like every leg of the chair, every leg of that stool is being considered, which is so critical. We talked, our keynote talked a little bit about needing to know your why. If we take it down to the people here, our demographics in Massachusetts are really going to demand some solutioning. And the thing that comes to my mind most often is that the majority of us, 3 out of 4, will likely need long-term care and supports as we age, at some point as we age. 3 out of 4. And given that today, nearly a quarter of our population are over 60, and that is growing very quickly, and that if we look past in 2010, you know, there were more people under the age of 20 here in Massachusetts than over 60, and now that has flip-flopped, and we have more the other direction. It's really important for us to consider the load that will bring with it. The great need that will bring with it. And interestingly enough, when we think about our population who is over 60, we can't think about them as a monolith, right? That is 5 decades worth of people. And up until recently, we mostly thought about the aging in of the baby boomer generation, which would give you people who, you know, in previous times we would have thought of as 60s into their 70s, and that was where the big population change was happening. Actually now, the greatest growth in older adult populations is in those over 80. That's where we are going to see the most growth. And of course, that's also when we end up needing more care or more supports to help people stay independent and you know, to have a life in the community that they choose. We also then need to think about, as you've mentioned, who's caring, who's providing the care for all the people who are going to increasingly need it. And that is predominantly our unpaid family caregivers. And I think there are studies out there that say in Massachusetts there's about 700,000 caregivers, but we think that's really underrepresented. Lots of people don't even identify as being a caregiver, and many people think, oh, this is just what you do. And the people giving those care are, of course, the Gen Xers who are on the early side of aging into that 60-plus population themselves. I know for myself, I long-distance caregive for my father who has dementia, for my grandmother who is 99 years old and living on her own, for my husband's mother, and for my own children, one of which needs additional support. So I don't know that I necessarily identify as a caregiver, but I am. And we know also that this affects caregiving itself when it's unpaid, when there are not other supports available, particularly in the middle income groups, affects the caregiver's economic security and viability. And that can have very long-term impacts as well, so that these caregivers, as they age, may need more support from the state. So, you know, all across the spectrum. Oh, and I should also mention that has an impact on our employers here in Massachusetts, and they know that full well. I was interviewing employers about this about 5 or 6 years ago, and their number 2 issue that they told us that they needed to solve was caregiving and the absenteeism and presenteeism and lower productivity and impacts to having people with expertise who stay on the job longer was really important to them. Number 1 was mental health, by the way. Number 2, caregiving. So all across the spectrum, we know that there are a lot of people who are going to need more help, and we're going to have fewer people who can provide that help as Gen Xers, and now millennials have fewer and fewer kids. So definitely the third leg of the chair.
That's the political imperative. Caregivers and the fact that the demographics have shifted so much and that we've got 80 and over growing. So last but not least, we saved the best for last. So we're still on question 1, so that means we could go like all day on question 2. And so I think it'd be great if you could share with the audience from what vantage point you bring. We've talked about Medicaid, we've talked about social insurance, you represent elder affairs, and really when we're talking about the system, you all know HCBS, LTSS, we're sitting in a room here represented by the ASAP community, the PACE, the SCO, the OneCare, all of these players. So you are in the finance business, financing care. Can you talk about why you think it's a political imperative, or do you?
Oh, absolutely. And certainly, first of all, let me say this. I cannot tell you what a privilege it is to be here and to listen and hear and engage with people who have such passion in this space. Because the first part of my answer, you've heard a lot about why now, but my thoughts involve the fact that we have to include everybody in this discussion. And I see a lot of everybody in this room. The other thing I would say is that when we were starting Care Scout Insurance, and some of you may know Care Scout is a division of Genworth Financial, and we just launched our business on October 1st. So we are a few days old. And but when I was sitting down to write a vision statement for Care Scout Insurance, it emanated from one theme, and that was enabling people to receive care in a manner that honors their humanity. And I see in this room that you all share my vision. So I'm with my peeps, and I'm very glad to be here. But I do need to talk a little bit and just add a little bit more color and texture around the cost issue on this. And Catherine kind of was hinting down this line. $564 billion spent on long-term care services and supports in 2023. Most of that, public funds. Catherine talked about Medicaid. That's the primary funder in the public space. The private space covered about 30%. $81 billion was money paid out of pocket. That's money that's reducing retirement savings for others. Now, the long-term care insurance industry paid about $49 billion, which is 8% of the total spend. So the numbers are staggering. That was 2023. The costs are increasing every year. Now, Genworth Care Scout conducts a cost of care survey every year, and it is quoted in just about every resource as the quintessential source for understanding how much care costs. And last year, when we did this, home care, and I'm going to start there, increased as it has previously. If you were a homemaker, these are people who provide hands-off support like cleaning and transportation, costs went up 10%. For home health aides, they went up about 3%. Now, in Massachusetts in particular, and those costs were about $78,000 for the first and $75,000 for the second, and I think I got that right. But in Massachusetts, it was about $86,000 for both. Same cost for both in Massachusetts. And what we're seeing is that in the home care space, those homemaker services are now getting billed out at higher rates, that people aren't making a distinction between the care that requires more skill and the care that doesn't. And that is the case in your state. It costs more in this state to go to a nursing home. It's about $186,000 if you're in a private room. That's about $128 nationally, $186 here. Costs more if you're in a semi-private. It costs more for just about everything here, which shouldn't surprise you at all. So those costs are staggering. You heard about the shifting demographic. It is real, so the costs will continue to increase, and the system just can't handle it. And then we have to think about those family caregivers, and we heard some reference to those. And there is a study that was just published by AARP and the NAC, which is the caregiving in the United States, and it was talking about the impact on caregivers. Do you know that 1/3 of people, family caregivers said, or caregivers in general, said they're not saving anymore? They can't save anymore because they're helping to fund care for somebody else. That's not sustainable. It talked about the debt they are incurring, the health issues. 1 in 5 said that they feel like they're in poor health. Why is the time now? Because that can't remain. Those people who are giving the care are going to need the care, and they're going to be worn out. Worse yet, they may go, you know this has happened, they may predecease the people they're caring for. That happens very, very often. So we have to act now. We heard the impact on employers, for sure. People can't find talent, they can't keep talent, and productivity suffers when people have to care for others. They leave early, they come in late, they've got to take time off. These are things that we really have to consider. The employer space is a great space for the awareness part of this, because employees tend to listen to their employers. So that's an opportunity to not only talk about the need, but to address the need. So why now? Because honestly, there is no tomorrow if we don't act today. Okay. Yeah, that deserves, exactly. No, that.
Thank you for your passion. Thank you for your advocacy. And so each one of you has confirmed what we know, which is we need to move forward. We have a political imperative. So assuming that the audience buys into this political imperative, what next? How do we reimagine a financing and delivery system? And how do we do this leaning into what you mentioned? HCBS is not just HCBS. It's mental health, it's substance use, it's community, it's the social needs, it's the housing insecurity, economic insecurity, food insecurity. And so we're not going to be able to, and huge disparities. Mark, your recent study that hit the globe, that I think it was 8 or 9 years difference, that income disparities lead to these mortality rates that are unacceptable. So let's talk a little bit about reimagining the system. And for that, I think I'm going to start with you, Mark, on reimagining the system.
I can't guarantee it's going to increase everyone's life expectancy by 9 years, but
just mine.
so, you know, this actually, the chart that you put up, Dr. Mattei, was great about early innovators, early adopters, the majority, and so on, because it goes to something that, in thinking about this, made a lot of sense. So one way we can move forward is to learn from others. And the fact is that we actually have a proof point of a system change at a state level. And here I'm talking about Washington State, the WACARES program. This is a social insurance program for long-term care where people pay in during their working years a certain amount, 0.56 of their Social Security earnings. And if they become disabled, they're able to qualify for benefits under the program. The reason I say we can learn from it is that, first of all, it all began with an actuarial study. Okay, and remember I mentioned that we are now on the path here in Massachusetts. The program was, it took 5 years to get up and running after the initial bill was passed. And they have been collecting premium for 2 years. There was a recall effort in the state of Washington this last election. And it was for people in this field, that had to be one of the brightest spots of the last election. You had the citizens of Washington State say, yes, we're willing to pay a tax into this program so that if we should become disabled, we will be able to qualify for benefits. And they get about a year's worth of benefits. So we have this proof point out there. They're going to start paying benefits this coming summer. And here in the Commonwealth, of all places, we should certainly know the power of being a proof point. I mean, think about Romney Care, the ACA. It took Massachusetts, actually, to pass universal access to health care through mandatory insurance to show that the whole system wouldn't collapse, and to really dispel with all the bogeymen about what happens when everyone gets insured. And to see a program get over the line, like in Washington State, I think will provide people with an opportunity. So maybe we're now part of the majority or the we're maybe not the innovators, but the early adopters, and we have that opportunity. I want to mention there are just a number of other states that are also looking into this. California, Illinois, Michigan, Hawaii, and they have a common denominator, which is they all started with trying to build up the information infrastructure by doing a study of what the costs and benefits are of different program configurations and trade-offs. So I'm really happy and hopeful because of the leadership in our state that we are now going down that path. So that would be a way to transform the system in two very important ways. A, it would actually reduce claims on the social safety net. And at a time when $3.5 billion is coming out, we want to make sure that those who don't have private alternatives have a well-functioning, well-funded social safety net. Two, for those in this overlooked middle who don't have the resources themselves to pay for care, many of whom can't afford private insurance, but would have to spend down their income and assets and make claims on that social safety net, this provides an alternative.
Mark, thank you very much. I'm going to segue to you, Bree, because you have just conducted another feasibility study, and so is Massachusetts a laboratory for innovation or early adopting? But I want you, as you're talking about this, to say, everybody gets really, actuarial studies are wonky. So big fan of actuaries here, big fan of actuarial studies. And we're going to get to selling that in the next question. But if you can share a little bit more about what you did and how you reimagine the system, at least financially.
Yeah, so I get the tough job of making an actuarial study interesting. I may be interested in it, but it is definitely not must-see TV for most people. So let me kind of tell it in a story, maybe. I mean, if you can imagine yourself as a person who is working in the state of Massachusetts, what the actuarial study took a look at is how feasible is it, and what are the parameters to consider of taking a small amount of a, let's call it a premium deduction from your paycheck, a very small amount, putting that into a fund at the state level, letting you continue to do that, let's say a certain period of time where you can vest in, and then when you need services or support, that money is there for you. That's essentially what the actuarial study was looking at. We contracted with Milliman, which is a very well-known, impartial actuarial consulting firm, which that's a very specific job, I think. And had just a great group of people, many of whom had worked with Washington before, who came in and we asked them to look at three things. We asked them to take a survey of what we have currently in our market. We asked them to evaluate three kinds of plans, and then to make some recommendations on what comes next. The three kinds of plans we looked at were a front-end plan, and this means you suddenly have a qualifying event, you need care. We will be able to provide money for your care right away, right? And that you will get a certain sum for a certain period of time for the first year or two of care needed, which is when most people are actually in need of care for like 1 to 2 years. So that is a front-end plan. And that would be very broad, right? Because everyone, right up when you have that event, could have access to it. The second option was a back-end plan, and that means you get a bigger, more rich benefit, but you have to wait some time to get it. So there's kind of a waiting period up front during which you pay for it yourself, perhaps, or find other ways of accessing. And then you get this kind of more rich benefit for perhaps a longer period of time. And then there is a catastrophic plan. And this is, we're going to give you an unlimited benefit, but it's at the tail end when there is like no other choice. And so during that study, we talked to a very broad swath of stakeholders, providers and consumer advocates, and our Department of Insurance and insurance brokers and all sorts of people, our legislators, and talked about, well, which of those kinds of plans seems like it would be most palatable or something that we could actually do. And we also talked about within those plans, and this was the study, the actuarialness of the study itself, what are all those parameters? How much money for how long? How long would you have to wait? What are the conditions? Where could you get that care? How would it have to work? And then we modeled all of that. So let me give you a few of the headlines from the study, which was kind of energizing. There are feasible options for public financing to long-term care. And in fact, a front-end plan could potentially be funded by a payroll tax or a premium assessment tax of as little as 0.68%, it's like 0.5%. Even a catastrophic plan would be only about 2.75%. It's a big jump from 0.5%, it's a big difference in plan structure. We heard from most of our stakeholders that the front-end plan was the one that was most interesting to people, and that makes a lot of sense because if everyone's going to pay in, it's pretty palatable to think that everyone might be able to get some of that benefit if they need it. All of that are just estimates, right? This is just a feasibility study, and there is a ton more work that would need to be done to get to the real plan and the details around it. And so that's kind of where we sit right now. Our Massachusetts Representative Stanley and Senator Jelen have a proposed bills in the House and the Senate for a special commission to evaluate statewide payroll deduction kind of plans like this. And that's a great next step. But I think the point is here, we can get into a little more detail about next steps in a minute, but I think the point here is this really could be game-changing. And we are seeing other states, one of whom has implemented this, many of whom who are interested. We have kind of a quarterly group of states now that are starting to get together to discuss how things are going, what they're learning. This is something that could have very far-reaching effects, and not just on older adults, but on the caregivers, for state, in terms of state finances, and all the downstream stakeholders who are out there. It's really exciting, and I don't often say that about an actuarial study, but it's so exciting. And I encourage you guys, if you're interested, the report itself is up on the web. It's linked in with the agenda for today, if you want to get to it. You can also just search for our long-term care actuarial study in Massachusetts.
I have to jump in for one. I'm breaking the rules. I apologize. Whenever somebody throws a number out, I'm always wondering, like, is that a big number or a small number? 0.5% or what? So I remember when we worked in Washington State at the time, the cost of the premium was less than the average cable bill that families across the income stream were paying. So that helped to put it in perspective.
Yeah, no, that's dynamite to kind of make it real tangible to people. How much will I actually have to pay? I'm very hopeful from the Washington example and from the Massachusetts example, and even as far back as class, if everybody remembers Obama's class proposal, I was really excited about that too. I want to turn this to presuming we can find a way to pay for it, that we think about how the system should work, the delivery system focus, the values of the system, the principles upon which this is grounded. So can we talk, we've talked about the financing a little bit. Can we also talk a little bit about both financing, delivery, and would you like to go next, Lynn? Sure. Okay.
So I can say this too about, and let me just transition to that by mentioning WA Cares, because that program affords $36,500 for care. And the state of Washington recently passed some legislation and also has some pending regulation, not yet published, right? Hazel Gooding is my colleague in government relations at Genworth Care Scout. I don't think that regulation has been published yet, but it's about how insurers can offer supplemental products that wrap around the WA Cares benefit. Now, we still are talking with Washington State about this, but Care Scout Insurance is extremely engaged on this because, once again, it's an example of we can't do it, one constituent can't do it alone. One stakeholder can't do it alone, and we look to engage even further than that. We are very interested in what's happening here in Massachusetts because we want to be able to partner with BRE and the state legislators and the Division of Insurance here to help and to ensure that there's a comprehensive approach to long-term care here. But speaking of comprehensive, let's move on to think about what it means to deliver that care and how insurers and others in private industry may help with that. And we have been talking about the notion of person-centered care. And you've heard that. It's certainly a term of art. It's an acknowledgement that people have different preferences, needs, they have different circumstances, and they have different values. And all of that kind of impacts how they experience care. Now, Care Scout Insurance is one of the companies that's part of Care Scout in general, and Care Scouts LLC is another division of Care Scout that has an actual approach to providing services, starting with the development of a network of providers to enable people to know where to go to get care. Oftentimes people just don't know where to go. And my colleague Hazel Gooding told me that, that resources are just all over the place. They vary by state. There's no one place you can go. There might be limits on what an organization that you approach can do. There might be waiting lists. So at Care Scout, we're trying to address that. And the business that's developing the services is doing just that with the Quality Network. It's home care providers, and they have been credentialed for quality, and they offer discounts that people can use. There's also, what care do I need? You need to have some assessment of the care, because often people don't understand exactly what it is that they need or where to go to get it. So when we think about person-centered care, we've got to enable people to understand what they need and where they can get it. We also have to have programs that acknowledge that there's diversity among seniors. So those programs have to be culturally competent so that people can account for their different experiences and the like. We want to be able, as an insurer, to enable people to age in place, because that's really the preferred situs for care now. So how we do that is really support those caregivers that are helping people along the way. And I have to say, I was looking again at that, the caregiving in the U.S. study, and the caregivers said this: we need some training on how actually to perform the services, the acts of care, but we also need some information on things like, this is what they listed in order: managing emotional and physical stress, keeping care recipients safe, managing paperwork and eligibility for services, and managing the challenging behaviors of the care recipients. Those are the top four, and I'm thinking, absolutely. And so we need to be able to enable that kind of information exchange when we think about the private sector. And I'll close with a couple of things. Certainly innovation in this space, and that really starts home modifications. There's going to be, and I think there's a panel later about tech and AI. And I think about the fact I have an aunt who died at 104, but started caregiving when she was in her early to mid 70s. And the people that she cared for were very open to her guidance and tutelage because she was around their age. One day we, came to pick her up and they were drinking wine. That's not the best thing. It was a little interesting. We had to say, you can't drink while you're on the job. But they were both sloshed, let me just put it out there. But they had a great time. They were loving life. But I was thinking that as an older caregiver, to help with the workforce issue, if there are some forms of robotics that can help with the mobility issues, you can have older adults who are participating in this space. And some of them are, stronger than you or I, but others who might need support, there's another way to address those needs. When I also think about person-centered care and what the industry can do, it's just acknowledging people's preferences as we deal with them. For a Care Scout insurance policyholder, I want to know what people like. I'm the first policyholder, by the way. My favorite color is purple, which happens to be the Care Scout color too. I want somebody, when I call in for services, I want them to say, Lynn, do you have on purple today? How was your morning tea? Because I don't drink coffee. I want them to understand that. And I go back to this same aunt who died at 102. There was 103, actually. For one of her birthdays, I gave her a packet of stuff. A silk scarf that was beautiful because she was in bed and she was very particular about how she looked. So this silk scarf, linen spray, and the like. But I also learned that she liked, Dr. Matei is not going to be happy. She liked Cheetos, not the crunchy kind, the soft kind. So I decided, I could do better than that. I'm going to buy the organic version, Annie's, of these things. So I bring them in, and my cousin, who was her primary caregiver, hands her the bag, and my aunt starts to tear up. Her name is Annie, and it's spelled A-N-N-I-E. And she said, that child has gone and had the Cheetos named after me. And I kid you not, the Cheeto bag, or the Annie's bag, stayed next to her bed and was featured more prominently than the silk scarf. And it was what she wanted. It was her preference. It was not the healthiest thing, but that's what she got. And I was a hero. But I kept saying, we need to tell her that, no, I didn't go and have her name put on a bag. And my cousin said, nope. Not going to tell her. But that was an example of just meeting people where they are and enabling them to receive care in the way that honors their preferences.
Okay, connection, dignity. The flowers must be in honor of you today, the purple flowers. Catherine, do you want to kind of round this out here?
So I want you all to remember that Mark broke the rules first. Okay. I am wondering, I'm looking at the clock, and I am wondering because I feel like my fellow panelists have laid out an incredible vision for what a reimagining of our long-term services and support system can look like. And I'm wondering if we should move to what's it going to take to get us there? Yep. What's it going to take to translate that vision into action? So I want to say two things. The first is that we, in order to get there, to get from the actuarial study to the reality, we need to come at this from a spirit of shared responsibility. Mm-hmm. And I think, just hearkening on some of what Mark said about going back to when Massachusetts, tackled the issue of healthcare coverage and was the first state in the nation to get us to near universal healthcare coverage, that was possible because all of the key players, the state, consumers, businesses, health insurers, health providers, everybody came together and said, we cannot afford the status quo anymore. And we are all willing to pitch in our share to build a better system. And that has got to be the spirit that aligns all of the key players to bring us from actuarial study to reality. The second thing I'll say, and just to sort of give us all, I think, something we can do, something actionable in our day-to-day lives to help bring us closer to reality. The thing I'll say is that the system that we're talking about, there are some costs. There are some upfront costs. And in order for that to be politically palatable, We need everyday Commonwealth residents, middle-income folks, to know, to understand that they cannot afford the status quo. And to get back to, I think, something that was brought up beautifully in our keynote address, to help people understand that, it's not, I hate to say this, Bree, it's not going to be the actuarial studies. It's going to be the stories of real people who are caught in the panini generation, as Mark would say. And actually, like, as I was preparing for this panel, I got a call from a neighbor of mine. We'll call them Samantha and Jack, live a couple of doors down from me. Their kids are my kids' age. They play together after school. Samantha and Jack are both teachers, and they have been living with Samantha's parents for the past 5 years, 5 or 6 years, trying to save up money for a down payment so that they can buy a home of their own. This has been their dream. And 2 or 3 weeks ago, Samantha called me up and said, we did it. We put in an offer, and it was accepted. And I'm sorry to say we are no longer going to be your neighbors, but we're going to be living a few blocks down. We bought our first home. And she was ecstatic, and I was ecstatic for her. And then 2 weeks later, she called me up to say, I have sad news. The night before the purchase and sales agreement, we got a call from Jack's father's doctor saying that his father's cognitive decline is happening quicker than they expected, and he needs to be put in a memory care unit. And Jack and I spent all night trying to work through the numbers and make it work, but at the end of the day, we cannot afford this mortgage payment and to help get Jack the care he needs. And so we pulled our offer out before the purchase and sales. And this is the reality for so many people. And that is why we cannot afford the status quo. But I guess what I want to put out there is that everybody here in this room has stories like that. Their neighbors, their friends, their clients, whoever it be. And I think even if you feel alienated by all of the policy weeds and wonkiness, everything that we've talked about on this panel, there is a role for you here to elevate these stories in your personal, professional conversations, and with people's permission, in your organization's, social media, in letters to the editor, and if appropriate, with legislators. So I just want to leave that here as we talk about this grand vision, what it's going to take to get us to reality.
Yeah, I also, building on the personal story, this morning I had to go to my 97-year-old aunt's wake. And she was one of 13 kids. I'm one of 12 kids. And we're all still alive, but there's one sister remaining. One sister remaining who is, 95. And she's scared out of her wits, and we all said, we've got you. We're going to take care of you. Don't you worry. We have you. But it's always, always the dilemma. Who's going to take care of the 95-year-old who's alone? What are you going to do? And my heart goes out to that young couple aspiring to buy the home and aspiring to have this independent life together. And we all have that story. So, share those stories with Marta, if that's okay. And tell Marta your stories, because this has to be a movement. This has to be a movement to move this forward with stories. So Mark, Bree, can you add to that? This sort of, what do we do to move this forward?
I think Catherine said it very eloquently. I would only add one thing, which is, and I think it's appropriate for Massachusetts, which is that we need coalitions of strange bedfellows. And what do I mean by that? I mean people who may disagree on a whole host of other issues, but absolutely have common ground when it comes to the LTSS challenge. So, here I'm talking about we've heard both employers and employees are challenged by this issue. They may not agree on a lot of other things, but this is an issue that they can agree on. Both the consumer sector and the provider sector suffer from a really underfunded system. So I do think that the way these things move forward is to bring together these strange bedfellows, people, organizations that wouldn't normally cooperate, or may on many, many issues seem to be in conflict, but on this issue come together. And that's just a small addendum to what Catherine said.
Mark, is this a Democrat or Republican issue, a D or an R issue?
I think that was my
That's-
reason for
yep.
positivity, my third trend, which is that this issue is not a Democratic or Republican issue. We all face this issue.
Well, we are very close to time. I think time might be up. This has been great. You all are brilliant. And Bree, last word on this, and then we need to.
I have a very quick last word because I couldn't possibly say any more that's already been said. I agree with all of you guys. Every one of, I think in our keynote this morning, it really hit me to see the slide that said you need to build awareness and then the will and then the change. And we're in that awareness and will point in time, and we all have a role to play in that. And I'll just close up by saying, you know, it's that age-old problem, that age-old saying, the best time to do this was yesterday, but the second best time to do this is now. So.
Really quickly, just acknowledge the complexity of what you have to do, grapple with it, but don't be overcome by it or consumed by it. And there might be moments where you've got to step away and leave the room, swallow hard, recenter, and re-enter. That's the only way we're going to get it done.